Chapter 1 Part 2. Even now it was only the seventh boy who was in his senses. His face was covered with acne, and he was dressed in a dark blue shirt with its collar turned up Elvis Presley style, and hideous grey jeans which had Madonna's face adorning each knee. He opened his eyes to glance at the others around him. His eyes were red, but not because he was in a stupor like them. A little later he straightened up and, shaking the remaining drug from the little container out into a cone, he pulled out a straw and began sniffing it. Then he threw away the straw and, taking some of the drug on a fingertip, tasted it very cautiously. Almost instantly, he spat it out. The stuff was of excellent quality, but his expression showed that he had not enjoyed the experience. He swallowed some beer as if to clear the taste of the drug from his mouth. The other boys lay around on the carpet, totally intoxicated and unaware of themselves. He looked at them thoughtfully as he drank from the beer can. His eyes, though swollen, were bright enough. The drug had not knocked him out fully. This had happened the last 3 times too. Though his friends had been knocked senseless after taking drugs, the effect on him was not so pronounced. The first 2 times he had left them in their stupor and had driven home, late in the night. This time too he wanted to get away. The odor of the drugs in the room repulsed him. He stumbled as he tried to stand up. He straightened up and, picking his key and wallet off the floor, he turned off the stereo. He looked around the room as if trying to remember something. Then he turned towards the door and, sitting down again, put on his joggers, tying their laces around his ankles. Finally, unlocking the door, he went out into the dark corridor. Groping his way, he went past the main door out onto the lawn. As he was coming down the stairs, he felt his nose was running, and when he touched his upper lip, he felt a sticky liquid on his hands. He switched on the light in the entrance and saw blood on his fingertips. Reaching into his pocket for his handkerchief, he wiped the blood off his fingers and nose. There was a strange sharp sensation in his throat which he tried to clear, but he felt he was suffocating. He took a few deep breaths to ease the constriction and spat 2 or 3 times. Suddenly he felt a tingling in his nose. He doubled over as blood began gushing out of his nose, pouring down the marble stairs like a stream. The prize distribution ceremony was underway at the golf club. Salah Sikandar was to receive the first prize in the under-16 competition for his 7 under par score. Applauding when Salah's name was called out, Sikandar Usman thought he would have to do something about the cabinet where the trophies were displayed. The trophies and shields Salah would bring home this year would be as many as he had in the past year. All of Sikandar's children excelled in their studies, but Salah was different from the rest. In winning awards, he was far ahead of them. It was not just difficult to beat this boy who had an IQ score of 150, it was impossible. Clapping proudly, Sikandar turned to his wife and whispered, "This is Salah's 13th trophy, and the 4th one this year." "You keep a record of everything, don't you?" she replied, smiling at her husband, whose gaze was fixed on Salah as he received the trophy from the chief guest. "Only for golf, and you know the reason very well." "I bet that even if Salah had been playing this tournament with professional players, he would have still won the trophy," he claimed proudly. Salah was shaking hands with the other winners seated around him. Sikandar's wife was not surprised by his claim about Salah. She knew that it was not an expression of paternal sentiment, it was the truth. Salah was indeed extraordinary. She recalled when he had played 18 holes at this golf course with her brother Zubair for the first time. The way he had brought a ball that had accidentally fallen into the rough, out onto the green, was a display of expertise. Zubair was amazed. "I can't believe it," he had repeated this statement endlessly till the end of the game. If the shot from the rough had amazed Zubair, then Salah's putters had floored him. As the ball rolled towards the hole, he leaned against his club and turned around to gauge the distance between Salah and his target. Shaking his head in disbelief, he looked at Salah. "Salah Sahib is not playing well today," muttered the caddy standing by the golf cart behind Zubair, who turned around in surprise. "So he's not playing well?" He looked at the caddy. "Was this a joke?" "Yes, sir, otherwise the ball would not have gone into the rough," the caddy said. "You have played here today for the first time, but Salah Sahib has been playing here for the last 3 years. That's why I say he's not playing well," he added. Zubair looked at his sister who was smiling benignly. Next time, I will be fully prepared when I come here, and I will also select the site for the game. Zubair was somewhat miffed as they walked across towards Salah. Anytime, any place, she confidently challenged her brother on her son's behalf. I want to invite you to Karachi this weekend, with all expenses paid, Zubair said casually as he approached Salah. Why? To play on my behalf against the president of the Karachi Chamber of Commerce. I lost the election to him, but if he loses a golf match, and that too to a child, he'll have a heart attack. So let's settle the score. Salah's mother laughed at her brother's words, but a frown creased Salah's brow. Child, he repeated with emphasis the only objectionable word in Zubair's comment. Uncle, I think I'll have to play another 18 holes against you tomorrow. Ashad opened the door and entered his mother's room. Ami, I need to discuss something important with you. Yes, what is it? Ashad sat down on the sofa. Have you been to Hashim uncle's lately? No, is there anything special? Imama is over for this weekend. Very well, we'll go this evening. Have you been there? Shakila smiled at him. Yes. How is she? She's come home after a long time, Shakila remarked. Yes, after 2 months. Shakila sensed Ashad was upset. Is there a problem? Ami, I find Imama a little changed, Ashad said with a sigh. Changed? What do you mean? I cannot explain what I mean. It's just that her attitude towards me is rather strange. Ashad shrugged his shoulders. Today she took offense to something quite minor. She's not the way she was before. I am not able to figure out the reason for this change. It's your imagination, Ashad. Why would her attitude change? You are thinking too emotionally. No, Ami. Initially, I thought I was being oversensitive, but after today, I don't think I am imagining things. She treats me in a very offhand manner. What do you think is the reason for this change in her attitude? She asked as she put the brush back on the table. I have no idea. Did you ask her? Not just once, but several times. Anne? Like you, she always says that I am mistaken. He shrugged again. Sometimes, she says it's because of her studies, sometimes, she says it is because she has matured now. It's not so far-fetched, perhaps, that is the reason, Shakila replied pensively. Ami, it's not a question of her becoming serious. I think she's moving away from me, said Ashad. Yuri being silly, Ashad. I don't believe there's any such issue. You have both known each other since childhood. You know your temperaments. Shakila felt her son's fears were meaningless. Obviously, changes do take place as the years pass, you're no longer children. Stop worrying over trivialities, she tried to reason with her son. In any case, Hashim Bai wants the two of you to get married next year. Imama can continue and complete her education afterwards. He wants to fulfill his responsibility, Shakila revealed. When did he say this? Shakila was taken by surprise. Many times. In fact, I think they may have started the preparations. Ashad breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe that is why Imama is agitated. Yes, possibly. The wedding should take place next year, Ashad replied with some satisfaction. He was a tall, thin lad of 16 or 17. He had a fuzzy growth on his face and had an innocent look about him. He was dressed in sports shorts and a baggy shirt, and had on cotton socks and joggers. He was in the middle of a crowded road, on a heavy-duty motorcycle, which he was racing recklessly without any consideration for traffic lights or oncoming traffic. Zigzagging his bike through the traffic, he periodically lifted both his feet off the pedals performing wheelies. Then, without breaking speed, he turned and changed lanes going the wrong way through the oncoming traffic. Suddenly he braked with a sharp screech. He raised his hands from the handlebars and the motorcycle slammed full speed into an approaching car. He was flung into the air and thrown down. He had no idea of what had happened, his mind plunged into a dark abyss. The boys stood behind the rostrums on the stage, facing each other. They were both canvassing for the post of head boy, and this was part of the election program. One rostrum had a poster saying "Vote for Salah" pasted on it, while the other had a poster of the other contender, Faison. At this point, Faison was telling his audience what he would do for them if elected. Salah watched him intently. Faison was the best orator in the school and was impressing the boys with his performance in a clipped British accent which was so popular. The excellent sound system carried his voice very clearly, and there was pin-drop silence in the hall, which was sporadically broken by the thunderous applause of his supporters. When Faison finished half an hour later, the clapping and whistling carried on for several minutes. Salah Sikandar also joined the applause. Faison looked around triumphantly, and seeing Salah clapping, he nodded in appreciation. As Faison knew well, Salah was not an easy opponent. The compere called Salah to begin his speech. To a roar of applause, Salah began. "Good morning, friends," he paused, and then continued. "Faison Akbar is certainly an asset to our school as an orator. Neither I nor anyone else can compete with him." He stopped again and looked at Faison, who looked around with a proud smile. But the rest of Salah's sentence wiped the smile off his face. "If it were only a matter of spinning yarns." Sounds of giggling filled the hall. Salah maintained a serious attitude. "But there's a great difference between an orator and a head boy. An orator has to speak while a head boy has to work." The hall echoed with the applause of Salah's supporters. "I do not have the eloquence of Faison Akbar," he continued. "I have my name and my record to speak for me. I do not need a stream of words where just a few would do." He stopped again. "Trust me and vote for me," he thanked the audience and switched off the mic. Thunderous applause filled the air. Salah had spoken for 1 minute and 40 seconds, in his typical measured style and calculated words, and in that brief time he had overturned Faison's ambitions. After this preliminary introduction, there was a question and answer session. Salah responded in his customary brief manner. His longest response was not more than 4 sentences. On the other hand, Faison's shortest response was not less than 4 sentences. Faison's eloquence and way with words, which were his strength, now appeared bombastic compared to Salah's short and sharp responses on stage, and Faison was all too aware of this. If Salah gave a one-line reply to a question, Faison, out of sheer habit, went on with a monologue. Whatever Salah had said about Faison seemed to be proving true to the audience, that an orator can only speak, not act. "Why should Salah Sikandar be the head boy?" came a question. "Because you should elect the best person for the job," he replied. "Wouldn't you call this arrogance?" came the objection. "No, it is confidence and awareness," the objection was refuted. "What is the difference between arrogance and confidence?" another pointed query arose. "The same as the difference between Faison Akbar and Salah Sikandar," he replied in a serious tone. "What difference will it make if you are not appointed head boy? It will make a difference to you, not to me." "How?" "If the best person is not appointed as the leader, it affects the community, not the best person." "Again, you are referring to yourself as the best person." Once again, there was an objection. "Is there anyone in this hall who'd equate himself with someone bad?" "Perhaps there is." "Then I'd like to meet him." Sounds of amusement rose from the audience. "Tell us about the changes Salah Sikandar will bring about as head boy." "Changes are not talked about, they are demonstrated, and I cannot do this before I become head boy." A few more questions were asked and answered, and then the compere called for the last question. A Sri Lankan boy stood up with a naughty smile. "If you answer this question of mine, then I and my entire group will vote for you." Salah smiled. "Before I reply, I'd like to know how many people there are in your group." 6, the boy replied. Salah nodded in assent and asked, "Okay, what's your question?" "You have to calculate and tell me that if 952,852 is added to 267,895 and then 399999 is subtracted from the total and 929292 is added to the sum," he read slowly from a paper, "then the figure is multiplied by 6 and divided by 2 and 492359 is added to the final figure. What would be 1/4 of it?" The boy could barely complete his words when Salah's response to this. Silly question came with lightning speed. 2035618.2. The boy glanced at the paper in his hand and, shaking his head in disbelief, began clapping. Faizan Akbar at that point felt that he was merely an actor. The hall was filled with applause. Faizan saw this entire program as nothing more than a joke. An hour later, coming down the stage ahead of Salah, Faizan knew that he had lost the competition to him even before it had begun. He had never felt as envious of this 150 IQ scorer as he did now. Mama Appa, when are you going to Lahore? She looked up from her notes with a start. Saad was slowly cycling around her. Tomorrow. Why do you ask? She shut her file. When you go away, I miss you a lot, he said. Why? She asked with a smile. Because I like you very much and you get toys for me and you take me out for drives and you play with me, he answered in detail. Can't you take me to Lahore with you? Mama was not sure whether this was a suggestion or a question. How can I take you with me? I live in a hostel myself, so where will you live? She asked. He pondered this over as he cycled round. Then you should come more often. Very well. I'll come more often, she smiled at him. You can talk to me on the phone. I'll call you. Yes, that sounds good, Saad liked this idea. He began to race his bicycle round the lawn. Mama looked at him absent-mindedly. Saad was not her brother, he had come to their house 5 years ago. She did not know where he had come from and was not concerned, but she knew why he had been brought in. He was 10 years old now and had settled in with the family. He was closest to Mama. She often felt very sorry for him, not because he was an orphan, but it was his future that she felt sad about. Her paternal uncles had also adopted orphans and their future too was a cause for concern for Mama. Book in hand, she continued to look at Saad cycling the garden. Watching him, she was often troubled by such thoughts, but she had no answers, there was nothing that she could do for him. What happens next? Wait for the next part. Thank you. All 4 of them were in Hiramandi, the red light district of Lahore. They were between 18 and 19 years of age and their appearance gave away their upper-class background, but out here neither age nor social background meant anything, because young boys often frequented the area and the elite were among the most regular customers. The boys made their way through the narrow lanes of the bazaar. 3 of them were lost in conversation, but the 4th looked around with interest and a sense of mystery. It seemed that this was his first venture into this domain, and a later exchange with his friends confirmed this. On both sides of the lane, in open doorways, stood women of every age, shape, size and complexion, fair and dark, beautiful and plain, all heavily made up and dressed in a revealing way. And men of all ages also passed through the lane. The boy observed everything very carefully. How often have you been here? He addressed the boy to his right, who laughed and repeated the words. How often? I don't remember now, I haven't kept count. I come here quite often, he said proudly. I don't find these women very attractive, nothing special about them, the boy shrugged his shoulders. If one has to spend a night somewhere at least the environment should be pleasant, this is such a filthy place, he said looking distastefully at the potholes and the piles of garbage in the lane. Besides, what's the point of coming here when you have girlfriends? This place has its own charm and there's no comparison between these women and our girlfriends. Girlfriends can't dance like the women here, the other boy said with a laugh. And today one of Pakistan's top actresses is going to perform, just wait till you see her. But you had taken me to see her dance, the first boy interrupted. Oh, that was nothing, just a mudra at my brother's wedding. But here it's a different story. But that actress lives in a very posh locality, why would she want to come here? His tone was somewhat suspicious. Ask her yourself today, if you want. I don't ask such questions, the other boys laughed at this remark, but the first one looked at him askance. They finally reached their destination at the end of the lane. From a shop near the entrance, they bought garlands of moshe which they wound round their wrists, and also on the wrist of the boy who was objecting to being there. Then they bought pan laced with tobacco and also offered one to him, he had probably never had pan before. They went up the stairs. He looked around critically, and a look of satisfaction crossed his face when he saw that the place was not only clean but well decorated too. The floor was covered with white sheets, and there were bolsters to recline on. Curtains fluttered softly on the doors and windows. Some people had already arrived, but the performance had not yet started. A woman with a lovely but fake smile swiftly made her way to them. As she spoke to them, the first boy took in her appearance. She was middle-aged, plastered with makeup, and sported masses of rose and moshe garlands in her hair. She was dressed in a screaming red chiffon sari, and her blouse seemed to have been made not to cover but to reveal her body. She led the boys to a corner of the room and seated them. As soon as he sat down, the first boy immediately spat the pawn out into a spittoon nearby. It was hard for him to talk with his mouth full of pawn, besides he did not quite like its feel or flavor. The other 3 boys were speaking in low tones. He looked around at the other men in the room who reclined against the cushions with wads of notes and bottles of alcohol in front of them. Most of the older men were dressed in starched white clothes. It was the first time he had seen so many people dressed in white other than at Eid congregations. He himself was dressed casually in black jeans and a black t-shirt like his friends and the younger crowd. A little later, another woman in garish clothes entered the hall and, seating herself in the center, began to sing a ghazal. Musicians accompanied her. After a few songs, she collected the money that had been showered on her and left. Then the famous actress for whom they had all been waiting entered the hall, and everyone's eyes were riveted on her. She twirled around and welcomed her admirers with a gracious nod. The musicians did not play this time, and loud recordings of raucous songs filled the room. The performer began to dance. The silence that had preceded her performance was broken by applause as the men noisily appreciated her dancing, and drinks went around. Some of the more intoxicated men got up and began to dance with her. The only one who sat still watching the performance was the first boy. His face was impassive, but if one looked closely, it was obvious that he was enjoying himself. When the actress came to the end of her dance about 2 hours later, most of the men in the hall had passed out. Going home was not a problem for them, as they had not come with the intention of going back anytime soon. They were there for the night. The 4 boys also spent the night there. The next day, on their way back, one of the boys turned to the first one who was looking out of the car. "So, how was the experience?" "All right," he replied casually. "All right? That's all?" Honestly, annoyed, he broke off in mid-sentence. "It's a good place to visit occasionally. What more can I say?" But it did not have that something special touch about it. "My girlfriend is better than the woman I spent last night with," he retorted. Hashim Yubin's entire family was present at the dining table. They were chatting amiably as they ate. Imama was the subject of their conversation. "Baba, have you noticed that Imama is becoming more serious with each passing day?" observed Wasim as he looked at her provokingly. "Yes, I've noticed this over the past few months," Hashim Yubin replied, his eyes searching Imama's face. Imama stared at Wasim as she took a spoonful of rice. "Imama, is there a problem?" "Baba, he talks nonsense and you fall into his trap." "I'm serious and busy because of my studies. After all, not everyone is as useless as Wasim," she said with some annoyance. He was sitting next to her and she rapped his shoulder lightly. "Baba, what will become of her when she qualifies as a doctor if this is what she is like in the early years of her studies?" joked Wasim. "It'll be years before Miss Imama." Hashim smiles. Everyone smiled around the table. This type of sparring always went on between these two. It was seldom that Imama and Wasim did not argue with each other. But Wasim was also Imama's best friend, probably their being the siblings closest in age lay at the heart of their friendship. And just imagine that, Imama, but she did not let him finish this time. She turned around and landed a fist on his shoulder with all her might. It made no difference to him. What else can we have at home but a doctor with a healing touch? You've just seen a demonstration, and you can guess how doctors treat their patients these days. One of the reasons for the rising death rate in our country. Baba, please stop him, and Mama conceded defeat as she implored Hashim Mubin. Wasim, he suppressed a smile as he turned to his son, who dutifully kept quiet. He emptied the entire contents of the paper bag into the grinder and turned it on. The cook entered just then. Chot Saab, let me help you, he offered, but was waved away. No, I can manage. But get me a glass of milk. He turned off the grinder. The cook got him the milk. To half a glass of milk, he added the contents of the grinder, stirred briskly, and gulped it down. What have you cooked today? He asked the cook, who started to tell him what he had cooked. A look of displeasure crossed his face. I won't have anything. I'm going up to sleep, don't disturb me, he said harshly, and left the kitchen. He looked unkempt with a stubble, and except for 1 or 2 buttons in place, his shirt front was open. Dragging his slippers on the floor, he went into his room and locked the door behind him. Then he walked over to the huge music system and began to play Bolton's When a Man Loves a Woman at full volume. He flung himself face down on the bed, remote in hand, and feet swinging to the music. Except for him and his bed, everything in his room was in order. There was not a speck of dust anywhere. The audio-video cassettes were neatly arranged on a shelf by the music system and on a shelf on the wall. Another shelf was filled with books, and the computer table in the corner reflected his organized nature. Posters of Hollywood actresses and various bands adorned the walls, while the bathroom door and a few window panes were decorated with cutouts of nudes from Playboy. Anyone entering the room for the first time would be startled because the nude pinups in the windows were life-size and lifelike and placed in special order. Along with the audio system, there was a keyboard, and a guitar, a piccolo, and an oboe hung on the walls. It was obvious that the occupant of the room had great interest in music. In front of the bed was a television cabinet on the shelves of which were several shields and trophies. In another corner of the room, cricket bats and rackets were artfully slung across posters of sports stars. It looked as if a tennis racket was in Gabriella Sabatini's hand, while the other was held by Rodney Martin, and the squash racket was in Jahangir Khan's hand. The double bed where he was lying on the crumpled silken sheets was a mess. A few pornographic magazines, mostly Playboy, lay scattered about with a paper cutter and snippets, evidence that he had been cutting out pictures. Chewing gum wrappers, an empty coffee mug, a packet of Dunhills and a lighter, an ashtray and scattered ash littered the white silk sheet that had holes burnt through. Somewhere there was a wristwatch and a tie, and a cell phone by the pillow where the young man lay face downward, perhaps half asleep as his hand mechanically but unsuccessfully searched the bed when the phone rang. The beeping went unheard and the remote in his hand fell to the floor as his grip relaxed. Michael Bolton's voice continued to fill the room with the lyrics of When a Man Loves a Woman. The knocking on the door became persistent and louder, but he lay motionless on the bed. Don't tell me. Mama, are you really engaged? Zainab appeared, jolted by Javeria's disclosure. Mama cast an accusing glance at Javeria, who looked at her shamefacedly. Don't look at her, look at me and tell me if it's true that you're engaged, Zainab addressed Mama sharply. Yes, but it is not something extraordinary or amazing that you should react like this, Mama replied with composure. They were all sitting in the library and trying their best to talk in low tones. But at least you should have told us. What was the big secret? This was Rabia. There's no secret and neither is it so important. Besides, we have become friendly only recently and the engagement took place years ago, explained Mama. What do you mean by years ago? I mean 2 or 3 years ago. But still you should have told us, Zainab persisted. Mama smiled at her. When I get engaged again, I'll definitely tell you, whether or not I tell anyone else. Very funny, Zainab glared at her. At least show us a photograph of him. Who is he? What's his name? What does he do? As usual, Rabia's questions came pouring out in one breath. He's my first cousin, his name's Ashad. The words came slowly and Mama paused thoughtfully. He has completed his MBA and runs his own business. What does he look like? Asked Zainab. Mama looked at her closely. He's all right. All right? I'm asking you, is he tall, dark, and handsome? Mama smiled at Zainab without a word. Javeria replied on her behalf. This is Mama's choice, he's quite good looking. Yes, we should have known, after all he's Mama's first cousin. Now Mama, your next task is to show us his photograph, ordered Zainab. No, her first duty is to take us out for a treat, interjected Rabia. But now let's leave, I have to go to the hostel. Mama got up and they all left together. By the way, Javeria, why didn't you tell us about this earlier? Zainab asked her. Listen, Mama did not want it, that's why I never brought it up, said Javeria. Mama turned around and gave Javeria a warning look. Why wouldn't Mama want it? If I had been engaged and that too to a boy of my choice, then I would have screamed it out from the rooftops, Zainab declared loudly. Mama chose to ignore her. What happens next? Wait for the next part. Thank you.